All right there, everyone. The post-secular vision of the Georgian Orthodox Church. That's what we'll be talking about on today's video. We often use this term post-secular on this channel, but it might be helpful if we review what that means a bit. Post-secular is a term that scholars have coined as a descriptive means of explaining what's being called the return of religion or the resilience of religious traditions in modern life. We have to remember that for most of the 20th century, most social theorists actually believed that religion was supposed to disappear in the modern world, right? So it was thought that the more we advance scientifically and technologically, well, the less religious we would be. But of course, as we look around the world, religions didn't die out. With all the scientific and technological progress duly noted, religion simply stuck around. In fact, not only is religion still here, but in many ways, religion has only grown stronger and more prevalent in the modern world. We actually have scholars such as Rodney Stark arguing that we're currently experiencing the single greatest religious renewal the world has actually ever seen. Now, what post-secularism basically does is it recognizes that given religion's resurgence, secular frames of reference really are just increasingly incapable of offering an adequate description of social reality as experienced by vast populations in the world, those both within and outside of the West. Secularism is simply not a plausible means anymore of describing social reality. And so scholars are employing this term, the post-secular, as a way of describing the current and indeed emerging social and cultural conditions more and more nations are finding themselves in. Now, one final caveat to all of this. Post-secularism is emphatically not talking merely about spiritual renewal or religious revival, which is it's very important to note this. Religious revivals are often notoriously limited and fleeting. Instead, post-secular scholars are aptly aware of what are called desecularizing or even counter-secularizing dynamics in societies, which, as the term suggests, are various counter-reactions towards secularizing processes and institutions. So what all of this means is that post-secular dynamics often involve a reconfiguration of political, cultural, and educational norms around religious beliefs and practices as a response to the secularizing processes of globalization. In other words, post-secularism tends to be holistic. It's not a little religion sprinkled here or there. Though it's diverse, post-secularity often involves a reorganization of larger social and institutional arrangements, and therefore requires a new way of defining and describing that society, which is what post-secular scholars are trying to do. Now, with all that said, few nations are exemplifying these post-secular trends today than the Republic of Georgia, at the heart of which is, of course, the Georgian Orthodox Church. What happened is that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union back in Christmas of 1991, the Georgian Orthodox Church emerged as the single most trusted, respected, and influential institution in Georgian society. And as such, the Georgian Orthodox Church has been, in effect, filling the mass vacuum that was left with the collapse of communism. The population of Georgia has consistently been ranked as one of the single most religious in the world. 85% of the population claims to be Orthodox Christian. They have a weekly church attendance rate of about 20%, which is actually very high, historically speaking, among European nations. And yes, I know, but I know that doesn't compare to Poland's church attendance figures. We have a lot of subscribers from Poland, and so before you comment below that Poland has twice those numbers of church attendance, I'll be happy to say it. No European nation compares to Poland when it comes to regular church attendance. Poland's averaging just over 40%, which is the same percentage of the population of that attends church regularly in the United States. All right, so there you go, okay? Back to Georgia. Now, to give you an idea of the national commitment to the Georgian Orthodox Church, check this out. 75% of respondents in a recent poll said that they would never vote for a political party that was critical of the Georgian Orthodox Church. How's that for some loyalty, huh? Again, remember, after decades of communist rule, the Georgian Orthodox Church has become the symbol of national revival for Georgians. So needless to say, Georgian politicians are consistently posturing to be seen as pro-Christianity and pro-Orthodox Church. In fact, a politician would have little political legitimacy if they were not in some way endorsed by the church. Now, this cooperation between the church and the state has been going on now for some time. Of course, Georgia's been a Christian nation since the 4th century, when it was the Georgian kingdom. But their Christian status was overshadowed for decades under the storm of clouds of atheistic communism. Once those clouds were lifted, as it were, the church almost instantly became recognized as an indispensable moral, spiritual, and cultural foundation for the rebuilding of the nation. And so in the mid-1990s, then President Eduard Shevardnadze made an informal deal recognizing the public significance of the church and the benefits bestowed upon it. And since then, the church's influence has only grown in the political arena. So, for example, one of the most significant developments that's taken place of late is what's been considered more or less the Christianization of Georgia's public school system. I think it's better to say the re-Christianization, right, after decades of Soviet-inspired atheism. The public school system, Georgia now, in the public school system in Georgia, it features Orthodox Christianity as part of its curriculum. They engage in Orthodox prayers. Orthodox icons and crucifixes adorn the hallways and classrooms. Now, again, to show you the power of this new post-secular order in Georgia, this re-Christianization of the public school system, it was actually threatened back in 2012 by the then pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-secular government, which sought to actually take Eastern Orthodox curriculum out of the public schools. And what this did, of course, is that it galvanized the Orthodox Church and Orthodox groups, such as the Orthodox Parents Union, to mobilize a mass backlash against these secularizing efforts. And so when the elections of 2012 came along, a far more traditionalist party known as the Georgian Dream was elected overwhelmingly. And they immediately reinstituted Eastern Orthodox education into the public schools. The Orthodox Church in this instance became a bulwark defending symbols of Georgian Christian nationalism against globalizing tendencies that sought to re-secularize the nation. We've also seen extraordinary success surrounding the Georgian Orthodox Church's campaign to revitalize the family. Georgia, for a number of years, had appallingly low birth rates, probably the lowest in Eastern Europe. And so Patriarch Ilya II began a campaign where he promised to personally baptize the third or higher child of married Orthodox couples. You had to have had at least 2 children, and then he would personally baptize them. Well, this is back in 2008, and since then, to the astonishment of demographers, Georgia's gone from having one of the lowest birth rates in Eastern Europe to now one of the highest. We're seeing a comparable demographic reversal going on, by the way, in Russia as well, under similar circumstances led by the Russian Orthodox Church there. But it's not unusual to read articles about the patriarch baptizing, 600 children in a day, Another area of interest is where Georgia demonstrates how post-secular societies actually comply with requirements and norms of thoroughly secular nations or societies, but without violating their own post-secular identity. I think this is actually a very interesting field of inquiry for post-secular studies. How does a nation dedicated to post-secular arrangements deal faithfully with a nation organization dedicated to maintaining secular norms and requirements? What I'm thinking about here is the way Georgia handled the European Union's requirement that all states applying for an EU-recognized visa liberalization, so as to become a short-term visa-free regime, In order to be considered for that, you had to have a law that prevents discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And so Georgia's parliament put together a bill under the close watch of the Georgian Orthodox Church. And the result was a bill that passed that had no stated penalties for those who violated the law, who would be guilty of discrimination against homosexuals and transgenders and all that. There was no penalty connected with that. And there was a provision that says, in effect, that no law can be construed to contradict the constitutional agreement of cooperation between the state and the Orthodox Church of Georgia. So the law technically fulfills the requirements of the EU in that it states you're not allowed to discriminate against so-called sexual minorities and the like. But the law fulfills those requirements without actually changing Georgian law in any substantial way, and that there were no penalties and there were no provisions that can in any substantial way contradict the moral norms and teachings of the church. So this, I would argue, would be an example of how post-secular societies comply with secular ones while maintaining their post-secular identity. Now, what are some of the takeaways from all this? Well, I think Georgia and many other nations in Central and Eastern Europe are showing us that they're showing us what desecularization looks like at multiple levels of society and culture. In other words, we all too often, I think at least here in the States and perhaps in Western Europe, we all too often think of religion in purely personal and subjective terms. This is, after all, how the notion of religion evolved after the establishment of what's called the Westphalian Order in the 17th century, which established the nation state as the basic governing structure in international affairs. And so it became commonplace to think of religion as something that affected people really solely at what we call the micro level, that is the level of the individual human person, with little relevance beyond the personal and the subjective, the private. But what post-secular scholars are noticing is that more and more societies like Georgia are evidencing desecularizing processes at higher levels, such as the meso level of institutions and the macro level of society itself. Indeed, some scholars are even recognizing a burgeoning post-secularism as what's called the mega level, and that's the level of international relations and transnational interrelationships. Because desecularizing or counter-secularizing processes respond to the pervasiveness of secular norms and dynamics, these processes inevitably reconfigure around virtually every aspect of demographic, economic, political, and cultural life within a nation. And indeed, as we'll explore in future videos, even relations between nations, promising what many are calling a post-secular international or world order. The emergence of a post-secular age indicates that religion can no longer be thought of in purely just the privatized terms. Religion can no longer be sequestered solely to the subjective. Religion is, in fact, once again reorganizing the totality of social and cultural life in ways that will have profound effects for the foreseeable future. And so these are just some of the examples of how the Georgian Orthodox Church is fulfilling just such a role. The Georgian Orthodox Church is playing a major political force in the renewal of the Republic of Georgia after decades of Soviet-inspired communism. At the heart of Georgia, we're seeing a major religious revival that has effectively desecularized much of Georgian society and awakened a renewed nationalism, and as such, stands strong against the secularizing tendencies and anti-cultural processes of transnational Brussels-based globalization. As the world becomes more and more post-globalist and post-secular, Georgia is a shining example of what the kind of nation that we will see many more of in the years ahead. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe. Please click on the Patreon link below. It helps support this channel where we analyze current events in light of conservative trends so that you can personally and professionally flourish. God bless.